In March of 1962, the United States Joint Chiefs of Staff unanimously signed a document proposing that the American government shoot down its own passenger airplanes, bomb its own cities, and murder its own citizens, then blame it all on Cuba to start a war. That document existed for 35 years before anyone outside the highest levels of government knew about it. It wasn't a fringe proposal from a rogue general. It wasn't a conspiracy theory. It was a formal memorandum, stamped, signed, and hand-delivered to the Secretary of Defense by the most powerful military officers in the United States of America. And the specific proposals inside that document, once you hear them, will permanently change how you think about the relationship between government and the people it claims to protect. To understand why this document exists, you need to understand the specific paranoia of early 1962. The Cuban Missile Crisis hasn't happened yet, but the Bay of Pigs disaster, the catastrophically failed CIA-backed invasion of Cuba, happened less than a year earlier, in April of 1961. President Kennedy publicly accepted responsibility for that failure. Privately, he was furious at the CIA and the military brass who had assured him the operation would succeed. The relationship between JFK and the Joint Chiefs was already fracturing, but the military wasn't finished with Cuba. Fidel Castro represented something that made the Pentagon and the CIA genuinely lose sleep. A communist government 90 miles from Florida, allied with the Soviet Union, with the potential to spread revolutionary ideology across Latin America. The problem was justification. The American public had seen the Bay of Pigs fail. Congress was skeptical. International opinion was watching. Any direct military action against Cuba would require a reason, a triggering event powerful enough to override all of that resistance. That was the assignment given to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Find a justification, create a pretext. And what they came back with was Operation Northwoods. The man who signed the document and presented it to Defense Secretary Robert McNamara was General Lyman Lemnitzer, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the single highest-ranking military officer in the United States military. This wasn't a draft. It wasn't a theoretical exercise. It was a formal recommendation from the unified leadership of the American military, requesting presidential authorization to execute. The full title of the document was Justification for U.S. Military Intervention in Cuba. And what followed that title was the most extraordinary and disturbing collection of proposals ever officially produced by the United States government. The document opens by establishing a core premise, and it's worth reading the actual language because it matters. The Joint Chiefs wrote, quote, "The desired resultant from the execution of this plan would be to place the United States in the apparent position of suffering defensible grievances from a rogue Cuba." Apparent position. Apparent. They weren't describing a response to a real Cuban attack. They were describing the manufacturing of the appearance of one. What follows is a numbered list of specific operations, not vague suggestions. Numbered, specific, detailed. Let's go through them exactly as they appear. Proposal number 1. Start rumors, using clandestine radio, of an attack on Guantanamo Bay. The proposal specifically mentions using Cuban refugees as the source of the rumors, so they appear authentic. Proposal number 2. Land friendly Cubans in uniform over the fence at Guantanamo to start riots, blow up ammunition inside the base, burn aircraft, and start fires in the surrounding area. American soldiers would be injured, possibly killed, and the blame would fall entirely on Cuba. Read that again. The proposal explicitly accounts for American casualties, not as an unfortunate side effect, as a feature, as evidence that would make the pretext more convincing. Proposal number 3. Simulate attacks on Guantanamo from the sea. Sink a United States ship near the harbor. The document suggests this could be staged with, quote, mock funerals, actual fake funeral processions, to create the impression of American military deaths for the press and the public. The architects of American military power in 1962 were proposing to hold fake funerals for soldiers who weren't dead in front of cameras for the American public. Proposal number 4. develop a communist Cuban terror campaign in Miami and other Florida cities, including Washington, D.C. The exact language specifies that this terror campaign should involve real or simulated attacks. The document then specifically states that these attacks should result in, quote, a "Remember the Maine" incident. That reference is not accidental. The sinking of the USS Maine in 1898, which almost certainly was not caused by Spain but was used to justify the Spanish-American War, was the explicit historical model they were using. They weren't hiding the logic. They were citing the precedent. This was the playbook, openly referenced in the document itself. Everything so far is disturbing, but the proposals that follow represent an escalation that is genuinely difficult to process. Proposal number 8, and this is the one that, when historians first read the Declassified document in 1997, made them stop and read the page again, involves commercial passenger aircraft. The Joint Chiefs proposed the following sequence of events. A real commercial airliner, a passenger flight departing from an American city, would be used in a covert operation. A duplicate aircraft, a drone, would be substituted for the real plane while the real plane landed covertly at an undisclosed location. The drone aircraft would then be flown toward Cuba and destroyed over Cuban airspace. The destruction of that drone aircraft, carrying no passengers because the real passengers had been secretly offloaded, would be announced to the world as Cuba shooting down an American commercial airliner. The document goes further. It specifically mentions that the aircraft should carry a passenger manifest of college students attending a summer vacation program in Latin America, not military personnel, not government agents, college students, specifically chosen because civilian victims, young civilian victims, would generate the most powerful emotional response from the American public and international press. This was the plan: a fake plane, a fake crash, a real passenger manifest of real names, names of real people who would be quietly relocated while the world believed they had been murdered by Fidel Castro. And then, the document includes language about releasing, quote, casualty lists to U.S. newspapers. Lists of names. People the public would be told were dead. People who would, in reality, be alive and in hiding somewhere. Every member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff signed this document. General Lemnitzer, General Earl Wheeler for the Army, Admiral George Anderson for the Navy, General Curtis LeMay for the Air Force, General David Shoup for the Marine Corps. Every branch, every signature, present and accounted for. But the airliner proposal was only part of the aircraft operation. There was a companion proposal, and in some ways it's even more chilling because of its specificity. The Joint Chiefs also proposed using American aircraft painted to look like Soviet MiG fighters, the kind of jets flown by the Cuban Air Force, to harass civilian aircraft along established flight paths. The document is specific. These fake MiGs would simulate attacks on commercial flights near Cuban airspace. The purpose was to create witnesses, pilots of commercial aircraft who would report to the FAA and to the press that they had been attacked by Cuban military jets. Genuine reports from genuinely frightened pilots who had genuinely been attacked, just not by Cuba. What the document describes here is a sophisticated program of manufactured reality, real events witnessed by real people that would generate real news coverage, all of it pointing toward Cuba, none of it actually caused by Cuba. And there's a detail in this section of the document that doesn't get discussed nearly enough. The proposals include plans to, quote, capture Cuban friendly saboteurs inside the United States. Friendly Cubans. That phrase appears multiple times in the document. It refers to Cuban exiles and CIA assets who would be dressed as Cuban government agents, sent to commit acts of sabotage or violence inside American cities, then captured by American law enforcement in staged arrests that would be covered by the press. The American public would see Cuban communist agents caught red-handed on American soil. They would be angry. They would demand action. They would support a war. The document also proposes the harassment of American shipping in international waters by American naval vessels disguised as Cuban boats. Real American ships attacked, with real damage, and real sailors potentially in harm's way, all to create evidence of Cuban aggression. Well coordinated. That's the phrase they used. Not spontaneous, not reactive. Coordinated. This was a program, not a moment. On March 13, 1962, General Lemnitzer presented Operation Northwoods to Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. McNamara read the document, and the response from the Kennedy administration was swift and absolute. The proposal was rejected, not debated, not sent back for revisions. Rejected. Kennedy was reportedly furious. 1 month later, in April of 1962, General Lemnitzer was informed that he would not be reappointed as chairman of the Joint Chiefs when his term expired that October. He was instead transferred to command NATO forces in Europe, a prestigious posting, but a clear signal. He never held the chairmanship again. Here is where the story takes a turn that explains why you're watching this video in 2024 and not 1965. The document was classified top secret. It disappeared into the National Security Archive. It was known only to the highest levels of government, and it stayed there for 35 years. In 1997, the John F. Kennedy Assassination Records Review Board, a body created specifically to declassify documents related to the Kennedy assassination, reviewed thousands of classified government files. Inside that review, someone found a document stamped Operation Northwoods. The document was declassified and transferred to the National Security Archive at George Washington University. Historian James Bamford, while researching his book about the NSA, found it. He published its contents in 2001 in his book, Body of Secrets. The mainstream press mostly ignored it. The Washington Post covered it briefly on page A16. No congressional hearings, no special investigations, no official government response. A plan to murder American citizens and start a war received less mainstream news coverage than a celebrity divorce. Let's be precise about what Operation Northwoods was and what it tells us, because precision matters here. Operation Northwoods was not a conspiracy theory. It is not something alleged. It is not disputed. The document exists. It is publicly available. The National Security Archive has it. You can read every page tonight. What it was, precisely, was a unanimous proposal from the entire leadership of the United States military. Every branch, every signature, to conduct what are now legally defined as acts of terrorism against American citizens on American soil, to manufacture public support for a war that the government wanted but couldn't openly justify. To be completely specific about what was proposed, the blowing up of a U.S. ship in Guantanamo Bay with American sailors aboard, fake funerals for American military personnel, a terrorist campaign in Miami and Washington, D.C., the shooting down of a drone aircraft with a falsified passenger manifest of American college students, MiG aircraft attacking real commercial flights to generate witness reports, and the staged capture of fake Cuban communist agents on American streets. Every single one. And here is the detail that the history books tend to underemphasize. These proposals were not the product of one rogue officer with an extreme worldview. They were the product of a formal planning process. They went through the standard channels of military staff work. Colonels and generals below Lemnitzer contributed to drafting them. Legal and operational review was part of the process. This was not a fever dream. This was a workflow. The document also includes language that reveals the architects understood exactly what they were proposing. There are references to, quote, the United States providing covert support for, and this phrase appears verbatim. Remember the Maine incident. They knew what the USS Maine was. They knew it was almost certainly not attacked by Spain, and they were proposing to do it again. The Maine killed 268 American sailors. The explosion that sank it was almost certainly an internal accident, coal dust or a magazine fire. But newspaper coverage drove by William Randolph Hearst's press empire turned it into a casus belli. America went to war with Spain, and the men who built the American military empire in the early 20th century had drawn the lesson. A dead ship and a newspaper front page can start a war. In 1962, the Joint Chiefs weren't proposing to wait for an accident. They were proposing to manufacture the accident themselves, with full control over the scale, the timing, and the coverage. This is the thumbnail promise delivered in full. They planned this. Not metaphorically, not as a rumor, with signatures, with numbered proposals, with operational details down to the passenger manifest and the mock funerals and the dual aircraft swap at a covert airfield. What makes Operation Northwoods historically significant beyond its own content is what it reveals about the decision-making structure that produced it. 2 years after Northwoods was rejected, the Gulf of Tonkin incident occurred. In August of 1964, the Johnson administration reported that North Vietnamese torpedo boats had attacked U.S. Navy vessels in international waters. Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, authorizing military force in Vietnam. No declaration of war was ever issued. 58,000 American soldiers died. Declassified NSA documents released in 2005 and 2006 confirmed that the second alleged attack in the Gulf of Tonkin, the one that actually triggered the congressional resolution, almost certainly never happened. The signal's intelligence was misread, possibly deliberately. Operation Northwoods is not evidence that the Gulf of Tonkin was a Northwoods-style operation, but it is evidence that the institutional architecture for that kind of operation existed, had been formally proposed, had been staffed through the system, and had received unanimous sign-off from military leadership, all within 2 years of Tonkin. The capacity existed. The will existed. The precedent had been proposed. The deeper historical implication is structural. Operation Northwoods was produced by institutions, the Joint Chiefs, the Department of Defense, the covert action apparatus, that had been built without meaningful civilian oversight of their planning processes. The proposal got to McNamara's desk precisely because there was no mechanism to stop it earlier in the chain. It took the Church Committee hearings of the mid-1970s, which investigated CIA assassination plots, illegal domestic surveillance, and covert action programs, to begin building the oversight framework that theoretically prevents this category of proposal today. Theoretically. Here is something important to hold simultaneously. Kennedy rejected this. McNamara rejected this. The civilian leadership of the United States government, when presented with this proposal, said no. That matters. The system, in this instance, worked, because the right people were in the room when the document arrived. But the system working in 1962 depended entirely on the character of the individuals at the top of the civilian chain. The document would have been approved if different people had been sitting in those chairs. The institutional structure that produced Northwoods didn't care who was sitting in those chairs, and here is the detail that closes the loop on everything. The proposal was never illegal. Not because murdering civilians and faking terrorist attacks is somehow legal, but because in 1962 there was no specific statutory prohibition against the executive branch authorizing false flag operations on American soil against American citizens. The law hadn't caught up with the capability. Here is what you need to sit with. Operation Northwoods was not rejected because it was considered monstrous. The historical record gives no indication that McNamara or anyone in the Kennedy administration reacted to it as a moral outrage. It was rejected because it was politically unworkable, because the risk of exposure was too high, because international opinion mattered, because Kennedy had already been burned once by a covert operation that went wrong. The moral category of, "we should not murder our own citizens to start a war," does not appear to have been the decisive factor in the rejection. That distinction matters more than almost any other single fact in this story, because it tells you something about the institutional culture that produced this document. It tells you that the men who signed it did not believe they were crossing a moral line. They believed they were doing their jobs, finding a path to the military objective they had been assigned to achieve. Operation Northwoods is not an aberration in American history. It is a precise, documented, signed artifact of the logic that governs covert power when that power operates without constraint. It is the answer to the question, What do institutions do when they want something they can't justify honestly? They planned this, not in the dark, not in secret bunkers with shadowy figures, in a conference room on government letterhead with typed, numbered proposals routed through standard staff channels and delivered in a briefcase to the Office of the Secretary of Defense. The document exists. The signatures are there. The proposals are there. The passenger manifest language is there. The mock funerals are there. The fake MiGs and the drone aircraft and the terror campaign in Miami are all there. And now you've seen it. Not a theory, not an allegation, a document. The same archive that holds Operation Northwoods holds thousands of other declassified files, many of them equally extraordinary, and most of them equally ignored by the mainstream press when they were released. One of those files involves a program that ran for 25 years inside American universities and hospitals that the government didn't officially acknowledge until a president was forced to apologize for it on national television. That story is next.